June 10, 1944. D+4. A wheat field outside the village of Bénouville, 3 miles inland from Sword Beach. 11 in the morning. The mist has burned off. The sun is brutal on the Normandy chalk. Major Derek Wehrmacht, commanding a squadron of the 13th/18th Royal Hussars, is standing beside his Sherman tank with his gunner, Trooper Surrey. The Tommy cooker is lit on the rear deck. There is water in a tin mug. There is the dust of 3 days fighting on both their faces. Wehrmacht writes in the squadron war diary that night. His words survive in the Pegasus archive. He writes that he thinks it was this incident which caused them to dig a pit under their tanks before brewing up. Read that line slowly. It is not the death that troubles him in the cold record. It is where to position the kettle. A German officer watching that field through binoculars from a hedgerow 800 yards away would have seen 2 armored men in the open, doing nothing tactical. He would have logged it as a target of opportunity. He would not have understood what he was looking at. The British called it brewing up. It is one of the great accidental phrases of the Second World War, because it carries 2 meanings in the same breath. To brew up means to light a fire and make tea. And to brew up means, in exactly the same words, used by the same men, what happens when a German armor-piercing round goes through the side of a Sherman and ignites the ammunition storage. The tank crews knew this. They used both meanings without irony, because there was no version of their war that kept the 2 things apart. The Germans had a name for the Sherman too, Tommy Cooker. The name appears in Hansard, an MP raised it in the House of Commons in March 1944. The German nickname for the admirable Shermans, he said, is the Tommy Cooker. The British soldier heard this and laughed, because it was true, and because there was nothing else to do about it being true. A Sherman tank hit in the wrong place didn't just stop, it burned. Crews called it brewing up. Then they climbed back in another one, and the Germans, watching this from their hedgerows, drew the wrong conclusion from the right observation. They saw men who joked about dying inside their own vehicles and who stopped in contested fields to make tea, and they classified it as the famous British amateurism, the inability to take a war seriously enough to win it. They were wrong about the conclusion. Everything they saw was real. The conclusion was entirely wrong. To understand why the Germans were so contemptuous of the British armor grinding south from the beaches, you have to go back not to 1944, but to 1939, because that is where the Wehrmacht's model of armored warfare was forged, and where it stayed. Auftragstaktik Mission Command. You tell a panzer commander what you want done, not how to do it. He moves, decides, exploits, breaks the enemy's rhythm before the enemy knows what is happening. Heinz Guderian wrote it. Erwin Rommel embodied it. In Poland, in France, in the Western Desert in 1941, it worked, because it was correct. The German tactical model of the early war years was, by any honest measure, the most advanced in the world. Their assessment of the British, formed in the desert against cautious generals and improvised brigades, was not insane. It was based on available data. The problem was that the data was 4 years out of date, because Erwin Rommel himself, the man who had outmaneuvered the British across North Africa, wrote in his own papers about Normandy that the day of the dashing cut-and-thrust attack was past and gone. He wrote that to break through the Allied front, you had to attack slowly and methodically, under cover of massed artillery. He was conceding, in the private record, that the British method slow, methodical, artillery-heavy, stopping in the middle of the day to make tea, was the only method that worked against what he was now facing. What looked from a German hedgerow like slowness and poor initiative was the only viable approach to a front held under total Allied air supremacy. The Germans called it methodisch. The British called it the right way to fight a war they were going to win. June 13, 1944. A village in the Bocage called Villers-Bocage, the 4th County of London Yeomanry, the sharpshooters leading the 7th Armored Division's column through a gap in the German line. They reach a crossroads feature east of the village. The column halts to wait for the infantry to come up. Crews dismount. Some light their cookers. Some stretch their legs after hours buttoned up in the heat. Half a mile away on a wooded slope, 4 Tiger tanks of the 101st Heavy SS Panzer Battalion have arrived overnight. Inside one of them, SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann raises his binoculars and studies the stopped British column. His gunner, Balthazar Voll, turns to him. The exact words were repeated to historians after the war by Voll himself. They're acting as if they've won the war already. Wittmann drove his Tiger out of the tree line. What the 4th County of London Yeomanry's war diary recorded in the next 15 minutes used a phrase whose double meaning the diarist almost certainly did not intend. RHQ brewed up completely. Headquarters burned. 20 Cromwells destroyed. 4 Fireflies. 14 half-tracks and carriers. 62 dead. Lord Cranley, the commanding officer, taken prisoner. One of the most experienced British armored regiments in the theater, gutted in a quarter of an hour, on a road where part of the column had stopped to put the kettle on. Here is the detail that doesn't appear in most accounts, and it should. Captain Pat Dias, in a Cromwell nearby, managed to reverse into a garden and get behind Wittmann's Tiger. Flank armor exposed. Point-blank range. The shot that would have killed the most celebrated tank commander in the German army at the moment of his greatest triumph. He couldn't take it. His gunner had dismounted. The man who pulled the trigger was not in his seat. He was somewhere else on the road, on foot, away from his position, when the battle came. This is the price that the brew extracted. This is what the Germans were watching, and what they took as proof of British amateurism. A gunner not in his seat. A shot not taken. 62 men dead because a column halted and behaved as if the war could wait 15 minutes. And yet the British did not stop brewing tea. They knew what had happened at Villers-Bocage. They knew the price of Trooper Surrey's kettle. They knew, and they did not stop, because the tea was not a habit that could be corrected. The tea was the doctrine. Here is the number this entire story turns on. September 5th, 1939. 2 days after Britain declares war on Germany, the Ministry of Food quietly takes control of every commercial tea stock in the United Kingdom. The London tea auctions, the center of the global tea trade, are shut down. From that day until October 1952, no private merchant in Britain buys or sells a single ounce of tea. The state owns all of it. Tea was rationed on July 9, 1940. 2 ounces per adult per week. Not first among luxuries, first among foods. Before meat, before butter, before sugar. Tea came off ration in October 1952. 12 years after rationing began. 2 years after the meat ration finally ended. 12 years. The Ministry of Food had contracted to buy the entire exportable surplus of India and the entire exportable surplus of Ceylon, which together produce most of the world's black tea outside Japanese-occupied Asia. The claim that Britain bought up all the tea in the world is an overstatement, but it is closer to the truth than to exaggeration. In 1947, the Tea Centre in London published a book about tea's role in the war. One of the chapter headings read simply, "Tea as Weapon." The men who wrote the rationing policy used that phrase themselves. Tea as weapon, not comfort, not morale weapon. The British government, in the act of going to war, decided that the tea supply was a matter of strategic survival, equivalent to ammunition and aviation fuel. 12 years on the ration card says everything about what they believed they were protecting. The Germans had acorn coffee. They had schnapps when they could get it. They had no national ritual of stopping, of asserting a domestic habit in the middle of a foreign field, of insisting that the men inside the tanks were still, in some essential way, civilians. They could not copy it, not because the drink was unobtainable, because the thing the drink represented was not transferable to an army built around the cult of the offensive. The British armored force in Normandy was not a Wehrmacht of cadet school professionals. It was an army of civilians. Sergeant George Dring, of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, known throughout the regiment as Killer Dring, had joined in 1935 as a farrier. His father was the village blacksmith of Fulbeck in Lincolnshire. He had learned horses before he learned tanks. By June 26, 1944, at a village called Rowray, he was commanding a Sherman called Aquila, and on that single day he spotted, stalked, and destroyed 5 German tanks. His method was to dismount alone and walk forward into the bocage on foot, with his binoculars, under fire, looking for the enemy. Then walk back to his tank and kill what he had found. A farrier from Lincolnshire. No formal training in armored doctrine. An ability to read ground that he had learned shoeing horses. His squadron leader was Major John Semken, 23 years old. Before the war, a solicitor at a firm in London. On the same day at Fontenay-le-Pénil, Semken's Sherman came face to face with a Tiger at less than 100 yards. He got off 4 rounds before the Tiger's turret completed its traverse. He immobilized it. Then, with the evening light catching German armor on the ridge ahead, he deployed his squadron and destroyed 8 enemy tanks without losing one. A farrier and a solicitor, side by side in the same squadron in Normandy. The Imperial War Museum has Semken on tape, interview 801997, talking about daily routine and what he called the phlegm of the British tank officer. That word phlegm is one of the four traditional British humors, the one associated with calmness, steadiness, and an inability to be rushed. He chose it deliberately. The Germans watching this from their hedgerows could not classify it. Their training gave them no category for it. By July 1944, the senior German commanders were beginning to understand in private that something was wrong with their model. General der Panzertruppen Fritz Bayerlein commanded Panzer Lehr, the most elite armored division in the Wehrmacht, formed from the demonstration units of the German tank schools, every officer an instructor, every NCO a veteran. In interrogation after the war, catalogued Ethent 66, he described the destruction of his division in a single phrase. The Chartres Road, he said, was the Jaboverenstrecke, the fighter-bomber racetrack. After 49 days of combat in Normandy, he said, the Panzer Lehr division is finally annihilated. In September 1944, General Heinrich Eberbach, who had commanded Panzergruppe West, was transferred to Trent Park, a country house on the outskirts of London, used as a facility for senior German prisoners. Every room was wired, every conversation recorded. The transcripts were published in 2007 by the historian Sönke Neitzel under the title Tapping Hitler's Generals. Thousands of pages of generals talking off guard. They discuss Hitler. They discuss the bomb plot. They discuss Allied artillery and air power with grudging professional respect. They debate strategy and operational choices. Not one of them discusses the British habit of stopping in the middle of contested ground to make tea. They had no category for it, so they said nothing. The Wehrmacht did not lose Normandy because the British made tea. Let that be said plainly. They lost because of American production, the Red Army, strategic bombing, Bletchley Park, and the accumulated weight of a war they could not have won. The brew was not the cause of their defeat, but here is what the brew was: a signal, visible from any German hedgerow to anyone who knew what they were looking at, that this army could not be broken by the methods the Wehrmacht had used to break every army it had faced before. In 1945, the British Army began design work on a new tank called the Centurion. It had a powerful gun, sloped armor, and a Rolls-Royce engine, and fitted as standard equipment inside the turret, for the first time in any tank in history, an integral electrically heated water boiler. The British Army, having spent 6 years watching its tank crews die outside their vehicles while making tea, put the tea inside the tank. The descendant of that boiler is fitted today in the Challenger 2. Forces News filmed Lance Corporal George Pawley of the King's Royal Hussars demonstrating it on camera in February 2023. The manufacturer's part number is FV706656. It runs at 24 volts. It boils roughly 3.5 liters in 20 minutes. 80 years after Trooper Surrey was killed in a wheat field outside Bénouville, the British Army is still drinking tea inside its tanks. The Germans had Auftrags tactic. The British had the brew. The Germans had the dashing tank commander. The British had Killer Dring, the village farrier, walking alone into the bocage with his binoculars. The Germans had the cult of the offensive. The British had John Semken, the London solicitor, 4 shots into a tiger before its turret came round. Whitman watched a stopped column through his binoculars and said the British were behaving as if they'd won the war already. He was not wrong. That was the point. They were not better soldiers than the Germans, man for man. They were not in 1944 more skillful, or more aggressive, or more professionally trained. They were something the Wehrmacht had no name for and no doctrine to answer. They were men in armor who had decided, by collective and unspoken agreement, that they were not going to be wholly at war, that they were going to keep, in the middle of the killing, a small domestic ritual from the country they had come from. They were going to put the kettle on, and the Wehrmacht could not make them stop. Subscribe to WWII Forgotten Frontlines. We find the stories and the details that everyone else walks past: the farrier who destroyed 5 tanks, the solicitor who killed a tiger at 100 yards, the kettle that the army eventually put inside the tank.